Welcome. You're listening to the Earth Conversations podcast, where we explore how to open up to the greater conversation with Earth herself and with our fellow co-inhabitants such as trees, animals, and plants through interspecies communication. In this time of environmental destruction, it truly is urgent that we begin exploring what Earth and her other than human communities are telling us. If you like to explore more in-depth material on this subject, please also visit our blog at earthconversations.org, where you can sign up to be notified through email about new podcast conversations, blog posts, events, and much more. We're excited and happy to have you join us for this podcast as we now go lie our heart at the ground and listen. Hi everybody, this is Maybrit with Earth Conversations podcast. Today I'm here with Leslie Davenport. Leslie brings the role of psychology into interdisciplinary dialogues that advance creative and effective solutions to climate change. Leslie is a founding member of the Institute for Health and Healing, one of the first and largest hospital-based integrative medicine programs in the United States. Her 25 years of medical experience developing an empowering and collaborative approach to resolving crises has informed her climate psychology model. She is the author of 3 books, Healing and Transformation Through Self-Guided Imagery, Transformative Imagery, Cultivating the Imagination for Healing, Change, and Growth, and Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change. Her upcoming book, to be released in August 2021 with Magination Press, will provide kits with resiliency tools for navigating a warming world. Currently, she serves in a climate psychology advisory role to Project Inside Out and the CO2 Foundation. She has participated in interdisciplinary climate think tanks hosted by the Post-Carbon Institute and Institute for Policy Studies. Leslie is a licensed psychotherapist practicing in California and Washington, and is also the creator of the Deep Imagination program at the John F. Kennedy University, and associate professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Welcome, Leslie. It's so good to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I would like to begin with just, if you could tell us a little about imagery, of guided imagery, because not everybody might know what imagery is or, what it is that you work with. So if we could, begin there.
Sure. Probably most people are familiar with a scripted type of imagery where you play a CD or a recording of some kind and you're invited to walk along a beach or go to a cabin in the woods. And the aim is often for relaxation or stress management, which all of that can be really valuable. But the way I work with imagery is rather than the images being suggested from the outside by a practitioner or a script, it helps people call forth from deep within themselves images that have meaning to them. So, for example, if the goal was to imagine a place that's relaxing, for someone it may very well be the beach or the mountain, but for someone else it might be their own backyard. It might be sitting by a lake. And there's a way to facilitate imagery where it becomes a very unique and personalized experience. And while relaxation is probably the most common form, what's wonderful about this way of working is that it can really be applied to any number of life experiences, resolving an old trauma, using an intuitive part of our minds to help make a significant life decision, working with healing within the body. So it introduces oneself to channels of awareness is maybe a way to think about it, that connect our thoughts, emotions, physiology, and ultimately environment, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. But it's a much more holistic way of viewing ourselves and our world than our more cognitive, logical mind.
Mm. So when you work with the imagery or the imaginary planes within yourself, what is it that we're doing?
Oh boy. Well, it's always easier to experience imagery than honestly describe it in a way where people go, "Oh, I get it," because it's funny. Because on the one hand, imagery is natural and inherent to how we as people function, but it's been really diminished and sort of turned off in much of our society and culture in the Western world, the industrialized societies. So I like to say, just as a way in, if you've ever worried, you've done imagery. It just may not have been all that useful or a healing form. But in other words, if someone was concerned about a difficult conversation, when they're kind of thinking about it, and maybe they're thinking about it at 3 a.m., they may see the person's face, they may notice their heart racing, they may notice their palms sweating. There can be just a full array of experiences that include often a visual image, hearing the person's voice, sensing the environment where a conversation took place or is likely to take place. And so that very full experience where we're seeing or sensing something, we're engaged, our body's responding, our hearts and our minds are part of it, is what composes an imagery experience. But there's a way to do it where we gain agency or a capacity to navigate it in a more skillful way rather than the worry sort of operating us. We get to operate within an imaginary experience.
Yes, that's a very good way of defining it, because I think when people think of imagery, they think of visual experiences first and foremost, but it isn't necessarily that. It's a whole body experience.
Yes. In fact, one of my little pet peeves that I try and emphasize when I teach is that imagery and visualization are often used synonymously. One is exchanged for the other. And that's because about 60%, just slightly over half, tend to emphasize the visual aspect of an experience. But as you say, it really uses all our internal senses. We may see things, we may hear things, we may feel things, smell things, have a sense of temperature if it has an environmental element. But if only part of those are present, the imagery is still being engaged. So it may or may not come with a visual component.
Yeah. And how do you, because imagination is not something we're taught in school how to actively use. As you say, we tend to use it very negatively when worrying. But so how do you find that when you start engaging people to actively engage their imagination, what kind of process is that?
Well, I will say that it almost always begins with the relaxation process, because while the terminology I'm going to use is a little bit outdated with what we've come to understand about how our brains function, it used to be called right brain and left brain thinking. So the right brain being the more creative, imaginal part of us, and the left hemisphere being much more the logical, cognitive, sequential thinking. It's just a little more of a complex mind map with what we're learning with things like functional MRI scans and things like that. But for shorthand, it's still helpful. So the relaxation helps us shift out of that usual mode of thinking to a more receptive frame of mind. Because as I was saying, the images are arising from within the person, so it requires a kind of active receptivity, a curiosity of mind, and not quite being sure what's going to be there. And the preparation in talking to someone about what this would be and in inviting them to be a part of it, I've found really varies depending on the nature of the person. So, for example, as you mentioned in my bio, I introduced imagery into a hospital environment for quite a number of years. And for some people, they wanted to hear the research, which thankfully there's a lot of it. How, for example, using imagery to prepare for surgery has really good outcomes, improved outcomes in terms of pain management, fewer complications, shorter hospital stays. And to hear something like that, and to hear that the hospital as a conventional institution is behind it, helps people go, well, yeah, I'm going to give that a try. For other people, they might already be meditators or be familiar with something that somehow is similar. And they'd go, oh, so it's kind of a variation of this mindfulness that I already do. And I say, yeah, there's truth in that. So that, would be a way in. Others just say, especially when it comes to health, my life's on the line here. I'm willing to try anything. I have no idea what this is, but let's just give it a go. So I tend to work a lot with meeting people where they are. And then answer their questions. And then, again, there's a way to guide people into this imaginal state of mind, which is a natural state.
Thank you. And then there's this other leg of your work, which is the climate psychology. And you'd also written a book about emotional resilience in the era of climate change. So, how do you connect imagery with climate psychology, or the emotional resilience that is needed at this time, because our planet is struggling?
Yes. Well, I will say that in retrospect, I certainly didn't realize it at the time, that my years working in the hospital ended up being sort of a boot camp that prepared me for the climate work. And the model that I've been able to transfer is that in the hospital, I brought psychology, imagery, meditation, mind-body medicine, but I sat at the table with physicians and body workers, and luckily this was a very integrative program. We had acupuncturists. And what we would do is we would do a grand rounds or a round table on looking at a patient's needs through these multidisciplinary lenses, recognizing the value of looking at it in these different ways. And collectively, in sort of a holistic discussion, could come up with a recommendation and treatment plan. So traditional medicine was always part of it, but so were these other ways of working. And it was rather remarkable, and I think somewhat unusual, that each of these views or practices were given sort of equal standing in the value of what their contribution was. And so when it comes to climate change, what I recognized is that psychology and this more holistic frame of mind has a really important part to play if we sit at the table with climate scientists and engineers and educators. And again, this round table where the solution doesn't sit with any one discipline, but it really needs to be a collaborative voice. And some of the specific contributions that psychology has to make, and I'll talk more specifically about imagery in particular, is, at some point we started to openly acknowledge that climate change is created by human behavior. And human behavior comes out of human thoughts, beliefs, worldviews. And yet there was very little of that happening when we were talking about, so how do we solve this? It was a lot about sustainable energy sources, which is fantastic, solar, wind, whatever it is sustainable agricultural practices and so forth. But what are the things that get people to be able to see and wake up to it, to work through their ambivalence, to work through their fears related to this? Psychology has so much to offer about how people change and support for lifestyle changes, how to work through denial, how to facilitate conversations so they don't become polarized and contentious if there's widely differing points of view, how to take care of oneself emotionally in the face of very frightening news. And there just is this whole world that's built into how psychologists and mental health providers get trained that are just such a natural gift to working in the climate psychology arena. So my efforts have been sort of several levels. One, to find a seat at the table and to help people understand why. Because even things like a psychological perspective on how messaging is done from a environmental nonprofit to the public, what images are used, what language are used, can either push people away or help support engagement. So a role like that. I've also been working a lot with training the mental health professional to be more prepared for what will be walking into the therapy room, the issues, and what we need to know about how to best support people who are either facing an immediate climate crisis experience or the fears as people become more aware. Eco-anxiety, eco-grief, words that are becoming more familiar now in anticipation of what the projections are if certain changes don't take place. And how to, you use the word resilience, which I think is really important. We all find ways to take care of ourselves emotionally, and part of it is stepping away from things when they're just too hard, or we've been in a struggle too long, or it's too overwhelming, which is part of it. But I honestly believe we also have to develop a capacity to be able to bear witness and remain present in the face of very difficult and challenging themes and experiences. And there's not a whole lot happening around how to do that, how to expand our capacities to be present and not always just move away. And I can talk more about that if you want.
No, I want to go back to that image you gave in the beginning of this, and that was that when you sat with a person, there was this round in the hospital. There was this round table of people advocating their specific mode of healing, as well as the Western medicine that is given in hospitals. So you had like a well-rounded board of advisors that could take care of the body, the mental health, the soul, I imagine, when it comes to imagery and the, both from the Western perspective and the more what is called alternative perspectives.
Yes.
And I got this image that, because when you talk about climate resilience,
Yes.
and you were talking about the earth and solar and wind, so I got this image of having this round table for the earth with with advisories for the whole of the earth. So solar is one part,
Yes.
and wind, all of these more technical part, which could be linked to Western medicine.
Yes.
Then you could have them all alternative ways, and also the imagery to connect the soul, so we see the earth as a whole
Yes.
being instead of just
Yes.
one part of her.
Yes. Beautiful. That's right.
And I was thinking, so how do we use imagery to connect ourselves to Earth, so we can
Yeah.
get that whole part of her, so we can start recognizing her as a whole being instead of just,
Yes.
this one leg of physical presence?
Yes. So one way I do that with imagery is, so again, if I was working with an individual, or it could be applied to a group, guide people through a relaxation process as a preparation, kind of quiet the mind and become more internally focused. And then I would invite people to allow an image to form for the earth. And it could be in any form. It could be kind of literally, the image of the planet, the globe. But the thing that's mysterious and wonderful about imagery is sometimes it's a symbol. It might be a glowing ball of energy. It might be a color. It might be a feature. And with imagery, we explore whatever arises. How big is it? What's the color? What are the qualities? Is there a scent? What's it like to be in the presence of that image? And once that image has appeared, we allow it to communicate. So this image of the earth, whatever form it takes, literal or not literal, we, using our inner ears, I might say, and if this image of the earth, and I would use the person's own words if it was one-on-one, had a voice or some way of expressing itself to you, what does it want you to know? And that can launch this very deep dialogue, because it's not coming from the familiar cognitive part of our minds. It's coming from, you use the word soul, from a different level, from a place where there's often an element of surprise, while hand in hand, there's this feeling of, yes, that's ringing true. Somehow that feels right. Even though I didn't expect what I'm hearing, there's a part of me that knows this is true. So there's this kind of resonance that's happening. And so questions can be asked, things can be heard. It can be very general. It can be quite specific in terms of, is there anything that this image of Earth is needing or wanting from you? And it can actually evolve into an action plan. It could be a deeper sense of connection that just affects the way a person moves through the world in a much more sensitive way. Some combination of all of that.
Yeah, I find that's the magic of imagery. It is that those symbols or those feelings, sensations, images that comes to us moves us. And once
Yes.
they move us, we don't need to remember them, because we will remember them.
Yes.
You don't need to work as hard to find the motivation, because it has moved you. So it moves you naturally to continue down that road of connection.
Yes, very much so. And you're sort of implying it in the way you're talking about it. But if we go back to the left brain, right brain, or cognitive versus imagery, our cognitive side by nature dissects. It divides things up, which has
Analyzes.
Analyzes, has a valuable role to hold up pieces and look at pieces. But imagery is a very interconnected holistic, seeing kind of the web of life, feeling the web of life way of viewing. And so just having that experience in a direct, visceral way, it's easy to imagine how that can influence our choices when there's this, day-to-day understanding that whatever we do, say, choose to do, not do, has this ripple effect that touches all of life.
That reminds me of Leslie have a website, and I, of course, will leave you a link in underneath this podcast, but there are quite a few resources on your website, and they're both blogs, but they're also audios. Yeah. And the audios I've found, if you want to start this connection with Earth and tuning into the wisdom of Earth and broadening your connection with her, there's a really good audio that connects your heart to the heart of Earth. And I find that a good way to begin. And then you can always, take it yourself from there and expand on it. But it's a really good guide, Leslie, for people who wants to begin this kind of work. And I also... Sorry, did you want to say something?
I was just going to add that they are free recordings.
Yes.
Just click and you're good to go.
True. They're free recordings and free resources on Leslie's website. And they're good. I can truly recommend them. I actually use them sometimes also if I'm even though I have a certificate in imagery and that I've, meditated for 10 years or more, I still find sometimes I need to just kind of I can find that I want too much or I try too hard. So going back and relaxing and just let somebody else do the talking for me instead of trying can relax me in a different way and kind of reset my system. So I actually use them a lot and benefit from them as well. Thank you.
Wonderful.
But there's also a blog post there where you actually mentioned this Indra's web. You were just speaking about it a little bit of this interconnectivity, and I think you wrote in there being deeply who we are, growing into a visceral understanding of the honor of being human.
Yes.
And this visceral understanding and Indra's net, and can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes. I think this is a really, really important aspect to understand. So one way that our divided, separate way of thinking manifests that I think many people can relate to is we think of ourselves in nature or in relationship to nature, like we're going to go on a hike in nature. What's more true is that we are nature. We're inseparable. It's kind of like colors of a rainbow. We can say that there's enough distinction that we can call one set of vibration red and another blue and another green. And in the same way, nature has this diversity of expression, but we are the same. We all rely on the same biosphere. We're made of the same elements. We breathe the same air. And while, again, we can go, well, yeah, that's true. That's true. There's still this way that we often view ourselves as separate, visiting nature. And when we get this inherent understanding that, we're breathing the same air, we're using the same elements that come from the food, we are part of everything. It changes. It changes because, so much of the damage that's being done is coming from this sense of separation, using and exploiting these things that we call things, like trees, right? Animals, whatever it is, that are in essence part of us, part of the same web. And like a web, you start to jiggle one part of the thread and it reverberates through the whole thing. And, it's just true on so many levels. That's how ecosystems work. That it's a delicate balance. And when one aspect gets out of balance, the whole thing starts to shift. That's what we're seeing why, in some of the climate change, that when the carbon in the atmosphere changes, it leads to just this vast array of ripples from, acidification in the ocean to melting of the glaciers to the coral effect on the coral reefs to the extinction of species. It's all one thing. And that all one thing is tied to our worldview, our lens of how we relate to each other and the planet and the animals. And that's why I feel like imagery has so much to offer, because it is born out of this holistic perspective.
Yes, it's so true. We are nature. And unfortunately, our language, at least the modern languages, are one of those things that have divided us and keeps dividing us from nature because, as you say, we take a walk in nature. We go outside in nature. When we're inside, we're not in nature. We have this whole perspective of this division, which isn't true. Mm-hmm. But I truly believe that the earth expresses herself through us because we are nature.
Yes.
So when we connect to our inner senses, to the inner visceral experiences, when we look inwardly, listen inwardly, we hear her on a deeper level or on a level where we haven't heard her much for the last centuries.
Yes.
Because we've been focused on the outward levels so much.
Yes. And as you're saying, again, imagery becomes just a way of many to do that, to hear her voice, to make space for that.
Yeah. And I find that this thing because you talked about the many levels that imagery works on and how that functions. And I was reminded once I did scuba diving before, it was in the very beginning of meditating, and I wasn't much aware of the inner planes or, the imagery planes or my imagination or anything. And I remember scuba diving and this whole new world in front of my eyes was blowing me away. But when I came up and I almost, went into sleep, or when I was relaxing, I started seeing things that I didn't see with my outwardly eyes whilst I was scuba diving, but were around me, which I couldn't see in the sea. I saw these creatures and things that was there. And I find the same thing happens so even though I don't see them with my own eye, with my physical eyes, their presence still affects me because they're there.
Yes.
And somehow I was communicating. There was a communicative experience happening on a plane that was.
Yes. I think one of the things you're speaking to is, sometimes we have this idea that imagination or images mean that we're going away from reality. Let's just go on a flight of fantasy somewhere else that's unreal. But what you're describing and what I've been describing is opening up to levels of reality that require a different set of eyes. It's kind of like quantum physics, where they say, is reality and certain energy patterns light or particles? Well, it's both, depending what kind of lens and equipment you're using. And that's what we're talking about, is we're utilizing lenses that allow us to sense or see or feel features of reality that are just simply not available to the cognitive mind.
Yeah. Yeah, and that going back to quantum physics, because we know that what we see outwardly with our physical eyes is 4% of what actually exists. So the rest we can't see. Maybe other animals, other species can see it, but maybe they're also on different planes of reality, being not less real than what we see with our eyes. And somehow we can connect to that through our inner experiences.
Exactly. And that's a really good way to think about it too, how other species might see the world, because some of it we get a little hint from science, but if we asked an Arctic ice worm to describe reality, or a bat, because of they navigate with their sonic systems a lot, and they would say, well, the world is made of XYZ, it's just a chunk of ice, or whatever the worm would say. It's just a reminder of how much our physical senses filter and define a reality that we just assume is the broader what isness of it. And what we're saying is like, well, let's be aware of our lenses, and actually there are others.
But and also this thing about how birds see the world. We just find out that even what we think is a colorful bird is not even nearly as colorful as what other birds or species of that same bird is actually seeing in that feathery coat of that. The colors reflected is so much more advanced than we can see. And how a bee perceives with its scent, or, it's quite extraordinary when you start, digging into how other beings perceive reality.
Yes.
So how about dreaming? Because I think the dream world is also somewhat imaginary, or occasions, or that inner dimension. How do you find the dream world, or do you work with dreams at all, or do you draw that imagery? How do you see the bridge?
Yes, there is a similarity. One thing they share in common is we can get a little distracted by the kind of the sparkle or the interesting, unusual features of a dream or imagery. For example, dreams can take place in unexpected locations with people or figures or things. And while those are clues, what I often try and do is dive a little bit deeper. So in other words, it's kind of like there's a meta message, there's a bigger message that uses dream images or guided imagery to cloak itself into something we can start to interface with. So, for example, sometimes with a dream, I'll often start by asking a question. If your dream was a film, what would the title be? Trying to get to an essence of the message. Like the challenge I need to meet, or the fear that is, happened, or the confrontation. Because I think we can get sometimes a little bit off track if we focus too much on, a particular, say, person who shows up in a dream. Sometimes our dreams borrow fragments of our experiences or thoughts, but it's the deeper message that's coming through those features that becomes the more important part. I don't know if I'm explaining that clearly. So it's similar in imagery. We invite an image to form, we explore it, but then we want to know again what the message is there, what it feels like to be in the presence of, what it's wanting us to know. And that's more important than the details of the image. So they become vehicles for a deeper message.
Yeah. And do you think that the earth can dream through us? I mean, do you think both that they can be messages from earth, or that she can actually dream through us in that state because we're more receptive or less cognitive aware.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I hadn't considered it quite that way, but with what we're talking about of the oneness, the levels that are all connected, the states of receptivity that allow those kinds of communications to be more available to us, it totally makes sense.
Well, I've heard people getting, there more and more people experiencing fear about climate change, but that could also be the human collective playing in, and the fears. Yes. But maybe I think that the world can dream up what she needs through us. So the fears, of course, very important to work through. Yes. But I think that more she can, if she dreams through us, because she can reach more people in that non-cognitive aware state.
Yes, that's really important what you're saying. The reason why it's important to deal with the fear is because that's one of the ways that we shut down. It's like, ooh, it's too overwhelming. Oh, it's too scary. So I'm going to distract myself, or I'm going to, it's where addictions come in. It's just like too much, too big. No, not me. And sometimes that would get in the way of what you're describing. Those are walls we kind of put up where we don't want to hear. Like, la, 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 I don't want to hear what you're saying. And so I think those work hand in hand, is that we need to be able to tolerate some of that discomfort in order to also be more receptive to what you're describing, is moving through the fear to that other vision, to that sense of possibility, which will also in itself help alleviate the fear. Because we can see, what we could go toward in terms of a more healing future.
And that healing is, because that was the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, because we can use imagery to heal ourselves. That, as you say, the research is bountiful on it. But could we also use imagery to heal the world and, the earth, or at least if we cannot heal the earth, we can help provide a space for healing for her, I would rather say. And the reason why I'm asking is that in a previous podcast, I was talking to Cynthia Jewers, who is a Tibetan Lama. And she works with Tara, who is this Buddhist goddess of the earth in different forms. She comes, I think, in different colors and in different forms. Excuse me if I'm not completely correct here, but she was speaking about this way of imagining the earth, of how she worked to imagine the earth as pristine and pure and waters flowing and really feeling that life energy again in everything, and clear air, and just that whole imaginary process of seeing the earth pristine again and feeling the earth pristine again in that whole visceral sensory imagery experience. And it was funny to hear it, but it touched me deeply because that wasn't an aspect that I had worked with the earth, but this has stayed with me, and I wanted to hear your perspective of what we can do with imagery in that way.
Yes. Well, it kind of goes back in a way from my perspective on where we started with the hospital roundtable, is that my approach tends to be, let's use it all. Right. I wouldn't want someone necessarily who needs antibiotics to only do guided imagery.
No.
You know what I mean? Even though imagery can boost the immune system. But in my perspective, it's not an either or, but it's an all. And so what you're describing, I think, is very true and definitely has a role to play. But I see it as a thread in this larger tapestry But again, it can sometimes guide more wise decisions that manifest as engineering or whatever else. Imagination becomes part of scientific discovery too. They don't live separately.
And I just got a whole new thought. How do you think our worrying about the future affects the earth? Because if worrying affects us and our body,
right. No, you're right. I mean, it's maybe one way of saying it is that because we know our thoughts, our feelings, our worldview affects our physiology, affects the earth, affects the environment. Everything we say, do, think, feel, eat, choose, don't do, is either health or healing promoting or the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. And so each of those things, we have this sort of this living, ongoing, alive sense of choice that everything, again, like you say, worry, everything, whether it's a physical activity or an internal state, has effects.
I think that's why I think your work with NGOs, of nonprofits that works with the environmental issues are so very important, because when I look out and I see there's a lot in the NGO world, there's a lot of us and them. There's a lot of reinstating the division instead of making whole.
Yes.
So I really value that you do this work when we're talking about this, because if all we do and think and the perspective that we carry around and go through this world with affects us and we are the earth, it affects the whole in that interest net.
Yes. It's that I need you, you need me, that, there is no other. There's the features, there's like an ecosystem, there's the diversity that requires and depends on each other and the different features. It's why, monoculture crops are not healthy. Yeah, no. It requires it all. So maybe, part of the work we do is we're weavers or we're bridge builders. It's, helping to make those connections.
Yeah. And the cry, monoculture crops is one place where I really hear the cry of the earth, because it is, for me, how I feel it or how I sense it is it's so painful for these crops and for the earth to be in this derived environment of interconnection and diversity that is almost as bad as a pig or a cow in small confined bars. But we haven't really, on a large whole, talked about that in the plant world.
And they're like shipping in bees to pollinate because they're not naturally there, and the runoff from chemicals into the streams. I mean, it just is, again, it's interconnected in the wrong ways. In unhealthy ways.
So how do we find this balance between not worrying and creating fear, yet being aware and working through the anxiety and the fear enough so that we can help carry the future or a more healthy, healing, whole future for the whole earth?
That's the question. Well, back to this idea of diversity, that we each have different gifts. The world doesn't need us all to be engineers, right? The world doesn't need everyone to be a teacher. What we need to do is recognize what are our own natural gifts and how can we our responsibility is how can we make those available? Because I don't view advocacy as only, carrying a sign and hitting the streets. That's great. And I do some of that too. But it is the educators bringing environmental issues into the classroom, politicians helping to be behind policy changes that are supportive of the environment, parents who are willing to have open conversations with their children and families. You with your podcast, making a platform available for people to listen to new ideas and become engaged in different ways. Me taking my training in psychotherapy and finding ways that it applies to environmental issues. I think when we feel that urge, like we need to do it all, is when we kind of lose the perspective that if we are each doing our part and we're doing it wholeheartedly and we're listening for the guidance of what we can do and watching for those open doors of opportunity, that will be the collective rise that we need.
Yeah. And speaking of that, and then suddenly the collective, we became very small all of a sudden as an Earth recently with the outbreak of the coronavirus. Our interconnectivity suddenly was shown very clearly to us. How do you see the effect of the coronavirus? But because it actually has that balance I was talking about before, of navigating through fear, but also to see that that wholeness and the interconnectivity, and how we came together suddenly in a new way. So it actually has that weight of balancing those two together.
Yes. And in that way, I think climate change does that as well. Same, very similar parallels is it's starting to highlight in undeniable ways, like you said, the interconnectivity of us as people and our relationship with the environment and the impact that an individual can have for better or for worse. Based on their own choices, like social distancing and wearing a mask and et cetera, can have widespread impacts. And also, how quickly things can change. Like with coronavirus, a lot of it was mandated. But things like the way that people shifted from flying places for conferences to so much being online, which has its pros and its cons. But just the fact that so much could change so quickly is actually encouraging.
Yes. And also to see how the environment actually got a little bit of a breath so quickly was also really encouraging, because if we do decide to change our ways, maybe it won't be such a long haul as we expected. Maybe healing or, can come sooner than we expected. And,
yes.
And I found that encouraging as well to keep up.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. Change or healing or growth, on the one hand, can have a longer arc, but it's also like a piece of fruit ripening on a tree. There comes a point when it just takes a moment when it's ready to fall because it's ripe. And so many of these efforts that have occurred and the discussions that have happened and the awareness that's growing is like that ripening fruit. And sometimes it can be a short amount of time when a significant change can happen.
So as we go on this healing journey, how should we prepare for it? Both our own healing, but also the healing of the earth, or providing her with that space.
Yes. Well, maybe one way to summarize what we've been saying as it relates to imagery and some of those inner ways of knowing is to cultivate deep listening. That's one of the ways I think about it. Because that receptive state of mind where images arise, or scuba diving, where just, expanding our awareness to notice with curiosity, fewer preconceived notions, noticing, as you say, the earth is always sending signals. So, and there's many ways to do that, to prioritize and set aside time specifically devoted to that is a great way to start if people don't already have a practice for that. And then that guides what our actions may be.
And I've heard you point toward this a few times when you speak, this field of unknowing, of not knowing everything, of creating that space. How do we handle that? Because unknowing is not natural in our world now, in our social.
Well, we don't think it is, but we've actually all become experts in facing the unknown, because truth is, we don't know a thing beyond this moment. We think we do. We sort of assume that the next moment's going to be a lot like this one. But actually, that's just our minds projecting. We are all always faced with a curtain beyond the moment we're experiencing. And so to recognize that we actually stand in the face of and navigate the unknown constantly. We just don't realize that's what we're doing. And truly, I have found this to be true. I have found, rather than the unknown being always just a scary thing, it can be kind of exciting, especially as you get to more comfortable, more familiar with the imaginal world. It's kind of like showing up to meet a mystery friend. We don't quite know what's going to appear, but there's so much goodness and wisdom and guidance that arises from these unknown spaces. And I think it takes experiencing that a little bit for maybe the tone to change.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with you in that. Working with the imaginary planes and connecting that way inwardly makes it less scary. Mm-hmm. Once you've tried it a couple of times, because you suddenly get this sense of adventure. I think people are also yearning for true adventure of Hogwarts and the station of the train station 3 1/4, and these things actually become real in its own less Hollywood way. But you can actually get to experience that, and that makes it a little more safe.
Yes.
Mm. Well, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. It's been, a journey, and I hope people have enjoyed it just as much as I have. I will leave links to your work, and I can truly recommend your books. They're very, very, they are really a really good guide to the imagery world as well, and that connection with yourself. And so I recommend you go and check that out. Is there anything else you'd like to say here at the end, or anything you would emphasize?
Well, maybe it more is emphasizing, because I feel like we have said it in many different ways, but it's just to reiterate that there's this standing invitation from the earth, from the realm of imagery, which is a gateway to wisdom and insight, maybe even love, and that it's just always available. And as you said, there's plenty of tools and resources for people to just try it out, but to just maybe consider heeding the call of that invitation if it's a new thing. Imagery is a new thing.
Yeah, the invitation is definitely open. Yours is always calling us to attention, I think, in her own ways.
Yeah.
And deep listening is the gateway, I think, into it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Leslie, for joining us today. It's been an utter joy. And
thank you so much, too.
And I hope, everybody, that you've enjoyed this. As I said, I will leave link. And until next time, please go lie your heart at the ground and listen. Thank you for listening to the Earth Conversations podcast. If you'd like to explore more in-depth material on how to open up to hearing the conversation that the Earth is trying to have with us, please visit our blog at earthconversations.org, where you can also sign up to be notified through email when new podcast conversations are ready, along with new articles and events. We would like to thank you for taking the time today to open up to the heart of the Earth and her ways of communicating with us. It is our sincere wish that you will tune into this greater conversation that she so desperately seeks us to have with her at this moment in time. To find the track to the wonderful music that underscores this podcast, simply follow the link below to iTunes or Spotify. Please take good care of yourself and the Earth, and until next time, go lie your heart at the ground and listen.
É terra, é mar, é vida infinita, é amor incondicional, é abraço apertado, carinho sempre dado, o aconchego no colo e o alimento no peito. É vida infinita.